Hello everybody, welcome to chapter 24. So in this chapter we're going to be continuing on from chapter 23 where we learned about genetics. We're going to look at how certain characteristics are inherited. If I can get this to turn. There we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is linkage. And the first type of linkage we talk about is sex. So sex-linked inheritance is associated with your sex chromosomes, your X and Y chromosomes. So we all have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 pairs come from or are called our autosomes. They are the somatic cells or somatic chromosomes that we have that basically code for every part of who we are. That 23rd set is the sex chromosome, and the sex chromosomes can be identical. If you're female, you have two X's. If you're male, then you have one X and a Y, so they're not identical in males. Sex-linked traits are traits that are on the sex chromosomes. Most are found on X chromosomes, because the X chromosome is so much larger than the Y chromosome. So here's a Y, here's an X. Y-linked traits are found on Y chromosomes. Females will never have those Y-linked traits. Dudley Winters, why am I saying Edwards? That's my daughter's last name. Dudley, no. Sorry. So in general, when we looked at X-linked traits, typically we see a lot of recessive traits there. Females have to have two of the alleles, so one from on each of the X chromosomes to actually show that characteristics, whereas males are more likely to show that characteristic because they only have one X chromosome. So if they received an X from mom that had that recessive allele, then they're going to show that characteristic, whatever it is. So an example is red-green color blindness. This is an X chromosome gene, and color blindness is recessive. Females can often be carriers, but only females with two recessive alleles will actually be colorblind. So color blindness is something that can happen in females, but it's not very common. Whereas in males, if they receive the recessive X chromosome from mom, then they will be colorblind. And so this is, in general, what you're looking at. If you're a female, you can have two dominant alleles. So this is homozygous dominant. You can be heterozygous and a carrier for the disorder, but you still have normal vision. You could be colorblind if both mom and dad gave you that allele. And then males have a 50% chance. A male is either going to have a dominant allele or the recessive allele. And so if you have dad who is not colorblind and mom who is a carrier but is not colorblind, she can actually pass on her recessive allele to her son, and her son will be colorblind. And actually, this is what happened in our family. My husband is normal vision, or not normal, normal color vision, and I am heterozygous. I carry this recessive allele. My mom also carried that recessive allele, so the chances of me having it were 50-50, but my dad had normal vision, so I also have normal vision. But I produced a total of 4 children. 2 were girls and 2 were boys. And one of my boys, my youngest, is actually colorblind. If you have an X-linked dominant disorder, then you're much more likely to see it in females. And both males and females can have this disorder. Males will only pass this disorder to their daughters, whereas females can pass the disorder to both daughters and sons. An example of an X-linked dominant disorder is vitamin D resistant rickets. So we need vitamin D to absorb calcium, but if you have this disorder, then you're going to be unable to produce the vitamin D, and you're not going to be able to absorb as much calcium. And rickets is a disorder that causes your bones to be very soft because you're not getting enough calcium in your bones. Calcium is what makes bones hard. Okay. So X-linked recessive disorders are much more common. There are more of them. Both males and females can show the disorder, but more males typically have the disorder. You can have an affected male even if both parents are normal, because mom can carry that disorder as a recessive disorder with a dominant allele for the other. This is a pedigree chart showing an X-linked recessive disorder. So here you have wife or grandma that has two dominant alleles. Here's grandpa who has a recessive allele. They produce two children. They produce a daughter that has the disorder, or that doesn't have the disorder, that is a carrier for the disorder, and a son who's normal. So the daughter marries a male who is normal, and they have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. One of those girls has the allele, the recessive allele, but she still has normal vision in this case, whereas the other son has the disorder. Over here, this son married a female who was colorblind, and they produced 1 child. That child is going to be colorblind as well. So we talked about color blindness already. Red-green color blindness is a recessive disorder. Another recessive disorder is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So this is a disorder that is typically identified by in young children because they're unable to use their muscles properly. What's going on is there's a protein called dystrophin that its function is to link the myosin, which is one of the proteins that's called a contractile protein. It links the contractile protein to the actual muscle fiber, and that allows the muscle fiber to contract. If just the proteins are sliding past each other, that's not going to do anything if the muscle fiber doesn't also contract with it. And so when you have the absence of dystrophin, you can't use those muscles properly, and that causes problems. Another disorder is hemophilia. Hemophilia is the inability to clot your blood properly. Most often, this is associated with the absence of clotting factors. Clotting factors are proteins that are produced by the liver, and when the liver produces these proteins, if you're not producing the proteins properly, then when you do get a bloody nose or cut yourself, you can bleed out, and it can actually cause you to have to be brought to the hospital. Today they have a lot of new materials that are being produced, and one of those things in biotech is they can actually make the clotting factors and inject them into the body so that you have those clotting factors in your blood. So this is a pedigree showing Queen Victoria and Prince Albert with 4 of their children. So an interesting fact about hemophilia It's known as the Queen's disease because it spread so rapidly or rampantly through the royal family. And the reason for this was because a lot of times they felt that royal blood was better than common blood. And so they would oftentimes marry within the family. And so here's an example of that, where you have a sister producing a child and another sister here producing a child, and then the cousins get married and have children. That disease becomes very common in that case. So the moral of that story is inbreeding is bad. There we go. So let's go on and look at what or how linked genes occur then. So we have chromosomes that contain lots of different alleles. So we don't just have a chromosome that contains the information for color vision or blood clotting factor or insulin production. One single chromosome can contain multiple, and most of the time does contain multiple different alleles and protein coding regions within the same chromosome. So a linkage group are all the alleles on a chromosome that are inherited together. When you talk about sex linkage, we already talked about that. That would be the sex chromosomes. When we talked about two trait crosses in chapter 23, we assumed that those traits were on different chromosomes so that they were not inherited together. Because sometimes alleles that are linked don't show independent assortment. They don't separate like they would in if they were on separate chromosomes. Hold on a second. Okay. So, well, I'll talk really quick here. So during meiosis, if you remember, we had crossing over occur between sister chromatids in that prophase 1. So when this happened, the non-sister chromatids of the homologs would exchange genetic information. If it did occur, then it would produce 4 unique chromosomes, versus if it didn't occur, then you wouldn't have those unique chromosomes anymore. They'd be similar. So if you look at how often crossing over occurs, that can help you determine if genes are linked or if they're closer together. So linkage actually helps us to determine the order of genes on a chromosome and how close those genes are. So here we have an example. This is from Khan Academy. So here you have a chromosome from mom and a chromosome from dad, okay? The A's are up here on this top or short hand of the chromosome. And down here we have another allele called B. So this could be for eye color, and this could be for color vision. Okay, so the color of your iris, the color, and if you can see color vision or not, right? So if crossing, or if chromosomes, if you have alleles on chromosomes, right, and you do have alleles on chromosomes, but if those alleles on chromosomes are far enough apart, then crossing over can occur and you can end up with unique sister chromatids. But if you have crossing over, or if those alleles are much closer, so here's an example where you have the chromosomes super close together, crossing over between is going to be very uncommon. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's in general doesn't happen. So the amount of times that crossing over occurs would help you to determine how close those two chromosomes are. If it happens 1 every 100 times, then those chromosomes would be considered about one linkage factor apart, or one allele apart, basically. And this is your figure. So the reason I put this on here is because this shows chromosomes farther apart and down here closer together, right? Or not chromosomes, the alleles farther apart and closer together. So you can really see that. Here, the alleles are at the exact same spot. I mean, when you look, but if they're completely linked, they never ever separate. So if A and B are on one chromosome and the other one has little a, little b, they're always going to be that same way. If there is crossing over that can occur, then that would be called incomplete linkage, and you have crossing over occur sometimes and it doesn't occur other times. So let's look at some of the disorders associated with our chromosomes and the number of chromosomes. So if you remember from the beginning of this chapter even, we talked about the fact that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 23 chromosomes came from mom, 23 chromosomes came from dad. And that gives us a total number of 46 chromosomes. If chromosomes don't separate properly during meiosis, then we can end up with a sex cell that contains too many or too few chromosomes. And that can lead to a slew of different disorders, and oftentimes it leads to, and most often I should say, it will lead to the miscarriage of that child. So non-disjunction occurs when chromosomes don't disjoin like they're supposed to. So remember, during meiosis 1, we have chromosomes lining up at that metaphyseal plate, homologs line up together, and then in anaphase 1, the homologs are separated completely from each other. So in non-disjunction, if it occurs during meiosis 1, then the homologs don't get separated. And so you end up with both homologs in one cell and the other one has nothing. And that would lead to either a trisomy or a monosomy. This can also occur in meiosis 2. So here we had normal disjunction here, but then in this cell, during meiosis 2, non-disjunction doesn't occur. Or disjunction doesn't occur, non-disjunction occurs. And so we have one cell that has both sister chromatids, the other one has none, and then over here we have normal disjunction occurred. And this again would lead to a monosomy, a trisomy, and then two normals. So normal development occurs when we have 2 of each type of chromosome. Trisomies can be tolerated. Typically, trisomies are easier to deal with than monosomies, but there are some monosomies that can also be dealt with. Most of the time, if the trisomies or the monosomies occur in the sex chromosomes, you have a much better chance of survival. If it occurs in other chromosomes, then there's going to be different problems that can occur, and a lot of times this leads to the spontaneous abortion or miscarriage of your child. So trisomy 21, probably the most common or most well-known syndrome, is known as Down syndrome. And individuals with trisomy 21 have a pretty good chance of survival in general, and the syndrome has a range of characteristics. So you can have individuals that are that have trisomy 21 and that are almost the same as a person that doesn't have trisomy 21. And then you can have individuals that have a lot of the problems associated with Down syndrome. So it's a very broad range of characteristics associated with that disorder. Chromosome 21 is a very small chromosome, but it has one gene on it that, if we have too many copies, will cause Down syndrome. So that gene is known as the GART gene. And 2 GART genes is normal. If you have 3, that causes trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. This is a karyotype, so we can actually get a physical image of what our chromosomes look like, and if our chromosomes are appropriate or look normal, then we can actually use this information to determine, if there's going to be any problems. So like in this case, the chromosomes all look normal. There's no extra chromosomes. So we can say this individual is healthy. They don't have any specific disorder associated with monosomies or trisomies. This individual is a male because they have an X and a Y chromosome. So let's look at disorders associated with the sex chromosomes. So I told you trisomy 21, one of the more common disorders, and it is a disorder that people can survive relatively well with. There are also some disorders associated with our sex chromosomes that people can survive in general with very little problems. So normal females have 2 X chromosomes. One X chromosome is called a bar body. It's just an inactive chromosome. So females have one X chromosome in each of their cells that is active. The other one is just kind of inactive. So males only have one X chromosome, which is always going to be active. So if a female only has one X chromosome, they will just not have this inactive bar body. Okay, this is termed Turner syndrome. And in this case, the female is going to survive. She can live a relatively decent life. It's a syndrome. There are certain characteristics that are associated with the syndrome. Short stature. A lot of times they have a very squat neck, and they also often have little folds in the back of their neck. Their ovaries tend to be non-functional, so they are not able to have children. These things can be treated. So if you have non-functional ovaries, you can take estrogens to help potentially allow you to maybe in the future have children. But I mean, oftentimes these women don't or can't have children. Another issue with this disorder is it often is associated with more cardiovascular problems and can lead to the death of individuals if they are not paying close attention to those things. The next disorder, if you have an extra chromosome X, for females, that would be called poly-X syndrome. Poly-X syndrome can cause severe problems depending on the number of X's. If you have 3 X chromosomes, typically that's not going to cause a lot of problems. But if you have more than 3, oftentimes that can lead to the spontaneous abortion of the child again. With 3 X chromosomes, females that are poly-X tend to be very tall. They tend to have more acne than females that have only 2 X chromosomes. Males that have poly-X syndrome, this they don't call it poly-X syndrome, but if a male has 2X chromosomes, that's called Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome, again, because you have that extra X chromosome, there are certain characteristics that can occur, but again, males can live a normal life. They may have outward production of more breast tissue, or they're not or, and they often have smaller penis, smaller testicles that aren't producing as much of the testosterone. But again, you can treat this by giving hormones, increasing testosterone to allow the male, to have normal body characteristics. And then the final one is Jacob's syndrome, where you have an extra Y chromosome. This is not a very common disorder, but it can occur. This disorder is only associated with the sperm, so spermatogenesis, non-disjunction occurs, and the Y. One sperm cell has 2 Y chromosomes. And I don't know a lot about Jacob's syndrome. There's not a lot of information out there. It used to be thought that people that had an extra Y chromosome had more aggression, but that has been debunked. So really, males that have Jacob's syndrome are just like any other males. So, I mean, I don't even know why it's called a syndrome, because I don't even know of any of the characteristics associated with it. I've tried to look it up. This table just shows those different disorders that we talked about. It talks about the chromosomes that are associated with the disorder, the number of chromosomes, if spontaneous abortions occur, how often, and live births occur, how often. There we go. So trisomy 21, I did talk about. This is the most common disorder that is considered a trisomy. It's easily recognizable because of certain characteristics within the child. It is more common in women who have who decide to have their children later in life, and that would be because of the number, or not the number, because our eggs are sitting there in our ovaries and have been with us since before we were born. So our eggs are getting older, and they're more likely to have problems when they go through meiosis. We can actually identify this disorder and a lot of other disorders prior to birth using amniocentesis or karyotyping with amniocentesis or with chorionic villus sampling. And then we can diagnose this disorder. So this is an individual that has trisomy 21. Here you can see the 3 chromosome 21s, and it's that GART gene that actually causes the disorder. The last thing in this chapter we're going to talk about are some changes within chromosomal numbers, or within, it's not the whole chromosome, but maybe the part of the chromosome changes, okay? And that causes a mutation to occur where you have only one copy of a specific gene. So typically when a mutation occurs, we have mechanisms built in that help us to fix those changes. So like DNA polymerase will proofread our DNA so that we don't have any problems. But sometimes damage occurs and there's no way to fix it. And so that can cause different disorders, including deletions, duplications, translocations, and inversions. So a deletion occurs when a chromosome loses a piece of itself. So you can lose the end piece of a chromosome, or you can even have two breaks where a middle piece is lost. So if you have a normal chromosome and then a chromosome that has a piece missing, that can lead to different syndromes. So cried cat is one of these syndromes. And over here, you can see this chromosome 5. Actually, it's I call it cried cat, but it's actually Credusha or something like that. I'm not good at pronouncing it. But it's a deletion of the short end, or the short part of chromosome 5. And some characteristics associated with it. Oh, sorry. There we go. Children tend to have a very flat face with cried cat. They have troubles with learning to speak, with walking. It's a syndrome, so there's lots of, there's an array of problems that can occur. But in general, these are some of the more common things. You struggle with walking, struggle with speaking, and so you have to learn ways to get people to understand what you're saying. So in one family, they were teaching their child sign language. So their child is talking, but also uses sign language to help them. These children tend to go through a lot of physical therapy to learn to walk, but even when they do, sometimes children will never be able to walk. So it really is dependent. And the name is a French name that means a cat's cry, because when they cry, they actually sound like a cat. And so there is a link here that you can just click on, and you can go to the video I have linked here. It's just the cried cat, and it shows a child, who's going through life, but it also, within the very throughout the video, I guess I'll say, it has the child crying, and the mom had recorded it so that she could share it with people so they understood what it meant or what it sounded like. Here's another syndrome with a deletion. So in this case, it's the deletion of the long arm of chromosome 7. And so they lose one allele or one gene. Individuals that have this chromosome missing, or this piece of the chromosome missing, have a disorder called Williams syndrome. Children with Williams syndrome have certain characteristics. So all of these children have Williams syndrome, and they all look very similar, like their siblings, but they are not related. So you can kind of see facial characteristics that are the same. Most children with this disorder also suffer from ADHD. They suffer from, or they have certain learning disabilities associated with the disorder. They tend to be very musically inclined. They like music. Music soothes them. Duplications occur when you have a region of a chromosome, as it's getting replicated. It is duplicated within the chromosome. So here we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Here we have A, B, C, D, E, E, D, F, G. So now we have two copies of the same information on one chromosome, D, D, E, E. And so that can cause problems as well. Hold on a second and I'll find a disorder, because I didn't grab one of those. So. All right, so I did find a duplication disorder. associated with the MECP2 gene on the X chromosome. When you have this disorder, hello, there we go. Oh, it's trying. There you go. So this is a child that has that disorder. These children tend to have problems with muscle tone, with and because they have problems with muscle tone, they oftentimes can't feed themselves, so they have to have feeding tubes. So this is a really sad disorder, and this is a picture that I just got off of Google Images. I was looking for something, a duplication disorder. So you could see one. Translocation is another disorder, or it is another mutation when chromosomes exchange information, but the chromosomes that are exchanging information are on non-homologous chromosomes. So normally your homologs, non-sister chromatids of homologs, exchange information in the crossing over. But when non-homologous chromosomes do this, then that can cause problems because it can lead to having 3 copies of some genes and less for another cell. And so one type of disorder associated with this is Down syndrome. So this occurs when the chromosome, you have translocation between chromosome 21 and 14. When that happens, that GART gene can be exchanged and end up on chromosome 14. So then this individual would have 3 copies of that GART gene and would have Down syndrome. Another disorder is Burkitt's lymphoma. This is associated with the translocation of the MYC gene on chromosome 8. The MYC gene is a gene that helps in maintaining normal cell cycle functions. But when you get this translocated gene, it doesn't function properly and leads to lymphoma. And so this is a child with Burkitt lymphoma. This is actually 1 day after starting treatment. And here's that same child when he was completely finished with treatment. So much happier, looks much better, and that's always nice to see that, change. So. An inversion is a mutation in which a chromosome, as it's being copied, it ends up turning or inverting, and when crossing over occurs, then the crossing over can actually lead to one chromosome getting too much information and another chromosome having too little information. It can lead to both duplications and deletions of information. So let me show you what that looks like. Here's your inversion. So here we have 2 chromosomes there. They're identical, but here you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and here you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G like it's supposed to be. So what happens is you have this inversion that occurs, and then when they exchange information, one of the chromosomes ends up having A, B, C, D, E, F, or D, E, B, A, and the other one has G, F, C, D, E, F, G. So that's a duplication and deletion that has occurred. That's the end of this chapter. So I'm going to turn this off and I will upload it into our Edpuzzle shortly. Bye.